Uh, there we go. We're back. Hi, Alexis.
Hi, I'm so glad we're back.
Yeah, me too. Hello, everyone. Sorry about a little technical difficulties. Apparently, everybody in the universe is using the same streaming platform we are right now. I mean, Kim Kardashian couldn't break the internet, but I think we just did.
Everyone's really excited about these diseases.
Exactly.
How many times
Exactly.
did he
So,
have dysentery?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of fans who played the Oregon Trail want to know about dysentery on this live stream today. Well, if you're just joining us, Alexis and I had spent a little bit of time talking about her book in general and also the reception to it. We're back now. We had just started to talk about Washington's diseases in his early life, particularly when he was on Ferry Farm in his youth before the broadcast cut out. So let's just pick up there. And Alexis, you had started to tell us about some of Washington's first real health challenges as a young man on Ferry Farm.
Age 15 was rough across the board in the Washington household. They, they were essentially, this was it was an agrarian society. It was a farm. It was
Mhm.
faring poorly. It was run by Mary Washington, who was widowed at that time, had a bunch of kids, Washington being the eldest. And he describes that time as the one of the roughest in his life, and that he
Mhm.
was so poor he couldn't even feed his horse to go visit his half brother Lawrence Washington, who lived at Mount Vernon, and that was his most important, richest, most well-connected relation. So that was a difficult trip to miss. But 15, rough age for everyone, really rough
Yeah.
if you have diphtheria, really rough. Chills, fever, bluish skin, foul smelling discharge, difficulty breathing,
Mhm.
gray coating on the throat, treatment, prayer, rough.
Ah,
And then we go to malaria, which he has at 17, 21, 30, 39, 52, 66. Um, diarrhea for all of
yeah.
these, just diarrhea forever. Bloody stool, rectal abs rectal abscesses, fever, sweating, vomiting, a little bit better than prayer, but not much. Barley water, flax tea, the waters. So you just go to like hot
Mhm.
springs, you take them in. If you've got, I mean, you had to travel still, and imagine traveling when you have river fever.
Oh, sure.
Bloodletting always to evacuate the poisonous matter. And then this big innovation happened when he was older. Peruvian bark. My God, changed nothing really, but it
What
was huge.
what is Peruvian bark? I mean, I've heard the term on occasion,
It
but
it is basically it is what it sounds like. It's bark
yeah,
from Peru, and they thought it did stuff to help. And I mean, it didn't hurt the way a lot of things did, but it didn't help. The
hmm,
next one is, I think, the most important disease of his career, shall we say. It's
sure,
smallpox.
yeah,
And he gets this at age 19. His only time abroad, he goes to Barbados. He's a fan of pineapple. He is not a fan of avocados. He's fine on guavas, very into the socializing. Poor Lawrence, who he is supposed to be attending to, or at least, his buddy along for the ride, is rapidly declining, which will be in the end good for Washington because he gets Mount Vernon.
sure.
Um, Washington definitely benefited often from being the last man standing. Uh, I mean, he still, so it was raging fever. It was awful, backache, sores, scabs. And that is why, if you look at sort of the texture of his face,
Hmm.
you can see that from a young man, he has sort of uneven sort of pock marks. And treatments, laudanum, this is when that becomes a thing,
I see.
given to women throughout all of the 18th and 19th century for just about everything.
Hmm.
And Washington hit it, hard enough, and he survived. But because he had smallpox, he became immune, which is what we're all sort of hoping if we get COVID, of course.
Sure.
And later on, during the revolution, he decided to inoculate
Hmm.
soldiers. And I don't even think one could say arguably that helped us win the war. It definitely did. And it got us through the first year at least.
Sure.
and inoculations had been illegal. Martha was extremely stressed out about this. She did not like to leave home, and the only thing she hated more than leaving home was doctors. And it was like a double whammy. But it says something about their relationship, that she did go through this in order to be with him and his, usually, at least for half the year during the war. Consumption, tuberculosis, buddy. Okay, this is my favorite. And I also was teasing Jim online that this was the name of his band in high school.
Exactly.
Bloody Flux. Bloody Flux is dysentery, but it's so much more fun to say. According to Washington, this is a GW quote straight from the source. Violent pleuries, which reduced me very low. He would complain for pages and pages about pay, but just a couple sentences about something like the bloody flux.
Yeah.
Bloodletting, the usual stuff. But this is, I got my first, I think this is how I actually got my first laugh out of Mary V. Thompson, much lauded Mount Vernon historian and author of. And it's because I gave her the opening line, and I thought of a chapter where Washington meets the widow Custis, who's in her late 20s, Martha Washington, who would become Martha Washington. And I thought if she said, she would tell me that I had gone too far or something. And the opening line is, not many great love stories start with a case of dysentery. But it's true. Yeah. If he hadn't contracted dysentery once again, had to go to the Capitol, he wouldn't have heard that Martha was like in the game, looking to date, but like being pretty choosy. And very quickly, within a few months, they're basically engaged. He meets Jackie 4 and Patsy 2, and we talk about him as not having biological children, but those were his children, as evidence from his many like. With Patsy, she has a tragic death, and it's heartbreaking. And so a way to see Washington at his most vulnerable, just the letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law after. But also with Jackie, it's a way to just see like Washington was, his efforts were never ending with this ne'er-do-well son, which they all had. All the founders had this generation, except for John Quincy, which even Abigail Adams was like, he's the exception. He's my swan. The rest are geese. What can you do? She still averaged quite well, I would say. They don't get a lot of credit, but they were our first dynasty, which is better than the forgotten dynasty, the Harrisons. I guess we have to move on. But he did have bloody flux at 22, 33, 35, 39. Quinsy, tonsillitis, just draining, fever for everything. I skipped cheek erosion at 44 from gum abscess, and I mean that's exactly what it sounds like. Carbuncle, this was a whole thing. I get into it in the book. Had to be drained. Quite the scare during the presidency. He had it at 57 and 59. Imagine being the surgeon, and I think it was a father-son, right, duo, and they come in and they have to. I wouldn't touch it. That's why I don't do that. Pneumonia, of course, bloodletting, draining as the treatment, then bloodletting. And then the last one, I don't mean to go like this, but I do.
Yeah.
The last one is death. I'm sorry, spoiler, he does die. I'm sorry for your loss. And we get to the last chapter of the book, which is about other things, his will. But Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, kept the best records, and also just his letters. He was a writer, and he would, Washington was not the liveliest writer. I think we can all agree. And Lear makes up for it. Definitely. And he goes into a lot of detail, not always consistent in every single letter in the aftermath, but basically what happens at Mount Vernon, your normal workplace, not your living room. One day in the before times, we met there.
Yeah, exactly.
And Thursday, December 12th, 1799, Washington retired. He has this like super long to-do list. He's been away from Mount Vernon for a long time. Not only the war, he was back for a little during what we call his unretirement. And then presidency, everyone's always wanting something from him. He comes back to Mount Vernon and he's just on it. He was a micromanager in like the worst sense of the word.
Oh, sure.
And he goes out, needs to go riding, seeing all the farms, seeing everything that's happening. It's raining. And he comes home after 5 hours, and Lear and Martha are like, go change your jacket, like dry off. But he won't because he's late.
Right.
And or just on time. But for Washington, that's probably late. And so he's got to join Martha out of respect for their meal.
Mm-hmm.
Not a good idea to be sitting in a wet coat. We know this. We later have our shortest occupier of the office, Harrison, who
Sure.
also was inaugurated in the rain and then would go and shake people's hands when he went to the market. This is all just like, I'm just giving you COVID CDC. I'm a plant. But he would, in fact, like that's how he died. So let's all, dry ourselves off, social distance, not a new concept.
Right.
So what does he do the next day? Instead of staying home, as apparently everyone told him to, including Lear, he goes out again. Why? Because he's Washington. And then the next day, still very clearly showing the signs of a cold, he needs to go out because some trees need to be felled, and obviously no one else can do it, even though he owns hundreds of people and he employs overseers who he trusts. Yeah. They're going to bleed him. He trusts them to bleed him, but he doesn't trust them to mark the trees. Just putting that out there. Typical Washington. So his voice is hoarse. Everything's going really badly. I think this is Saturday by now. And they're having a nice, after dinner moment. Martha, Tobias Lear, of course, who's now family. And Martha goes upstairs to check on Nellie, who is, an adopted daughter, and she has her child there, and she wants to go visit a little baby because Martha Washington all about the babies. The second she goes upstairs, Lear starts reading that newspaper, and Washington, despite being hoarse, and this is like, so the thing with Washington is so self-controlled, really. Sure. And this is something he cultivated. Wasn't born that way. Wasn't destined. This is something he worked really hard at. As you know, because those letters when he was younger took, page 3 before he would say, "Oh, I assassinated a diplomat." The first 3 pages are like, "I'm pretty upset about my pay." And this is something he taught himself. So it's also it's a wonderful story of self-improvement, I think. Maybe not this far though. So Lear is reading the newspaper and he gets to this part about the Virginia Assembly, which Lear should have known. I think we all agree to skip over because nothing good was going to happen. And the news was that James
Monroe,
bad James. This is a good James, bad James Monroe, had been elected governor with Madison's backing. So like two bad James. Used to be good. They're estranged. They're frenemies, not talking, not speaking. Lots of animosity. I have Washington's annotations on a book that Monroe wrote, one of the first presidential tell-alls. So his cabinet turned on him too a little bit. I mean, mistakes were made on both sides, but good people. So so then Lear is like, this was a mistake. He's all upset. He's much affected, which I think was tell me if I'm wrong, was a very polite way of saying that he started to curse a lot.
I would imagine you're probably right.
I think I'm right. And so Lear's like, please go to bed. Just like give it a rest. You were president twice. You won the war. You're fine. They've got nothing on you. And Washington says, fine, I'll go to bed. Lear, while he's walking out, I'm adding this. I don't know if it was this dramatic, but Lear does say, hey, why don't you actually take some medicine? And Washington's like, I don't take medicine It's not that he was an anti-vaxxer, though. That's not it. He just didn't treat his colds in that way. He was
Right.
more of like a team, a Daryl. It's like just like power through.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna ride with a pillow under my butt. This is how he deals with life. And he basically just says like, let it go as it came. So I got it naturally, although inviting it by being out in the rain so much.
Sure.
2 a.m. He wakes Martha. She's recently had a cold, and so he doesn't allow her to get out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
And she really wants to, but won't allow her. So he's, progressively getting worse. And he agrees that he'll send for the doctor when Caroline, one of the enslaved house servants, comes to light their fire. And she does, and various doctors are sent for. Washington, though, immediately asks for George Rollins, an overseer at Mount Vernon, who did some bloodletting on the side, and he drinks this like mixture of molasses. And I do think this was Martha's idea. He drinks this tea, and honey. It helps when you have a cold, but it ended up like basically choking him. So things are not
Sure.
good from the get-go. Lear says Washington. Lear is like he's basically hopefully taking notes. We've taken him at his word. It
Yeah.
seems everything matches up, but Lear hears Washington tell Rollins, "Don't be afraid," because remember this is George Washington, and he's like
Yeah.
incredibly sick, more sick than Rollins had ever seen him, than
Mm-hmm.
anyone had ever seen him. It's one of these like really moving moments. I would argue, like at West Point, when he takes out his glasses to read, he shows the soldiers that he has also suffered, and
Sure.
they find it quite moving. And so it's something because he just always kept it together.
Mm-hmm.
And not only does he say don't be afraid, but he looks at the cut that Rollins gave him. He's like, you can do better than that.
Yeah.
Bigger.
Let's get it
Much,
deeper.
much bigger. So he just like keeps insisting on being bled. He keeps like he literally says more.
Yeah.
Then comes more tea, more doctors, none of them particularly advanced in their knowledge. Again, not their fault. It's just sort of the way it is. And so Lear starts writing like the blood is coming out really thick and slowly,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like gloopy, meaning that he's given too much.
Mm-hmm.
Martha can't take it. Martha's left. She's like,
Yeah.
I'm not here for this. I'm done. And people are coming in and out. He's being moved. There are several enslaved people in the room, Christopher, Caroline, a bunch of other people who are like moving him around, trying to help, trying to make him comfortable. Around 4:30, he asks for Martha.
Mm.
And he tells her to bring 2 wills. And that's another story. It's in the final chapter. We're gonna stick to his body, but I'm looking at my book, of course. And by the way, books are amazing. I love them. So Washington's like, come here, Lear. I knew this was gonna kill me. I knew from the moment I got this cold, which is like, it seemed like you were pretty casual when it started, but fine.
Yeah.
This is the one. But I do feel like he sort of said that every time, like, whatever, if I die, I die, Providence,
Mm-hmm.
blah, blah, blah. I've outlived everyone. But then he starts saying these really dramatic statements, which I think a lot of chapters and books have been named after about this time, which
Yeah.
is Doctor, I die hard. And he's describing, right, Jim? He's describing his experience.
Yeah.
And I think from what I've said, we can all agree that he indeed did die hard.
He sure did. Yeah.
He went Washington 100%, but he says, I'm not afraid to go, which is not totally true. Like he has some more blistering, he has whatever, but then he calls Lear in again. It's 10 o'clock at night. This has been going on now for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to read the quote. It's so good. So Washington, no fear, Washington. Don't let my body be put in the vault, so his burial place, in less than 3 days after I am dead. And that's because he was afraid that he would be buried alive. And then Lear's like, okay, I got you. And I just imagine because Washington like grabs Lear by his, whatever he was wearing,
His
and it's like,
lapel or whatever. Yeah.
I don't know if you heard me. Like, do you understand me? Because he can barely talk. And he's like, do you understand me? And Lear's like, no, 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 I understand you.
Yeah.
You're afraid of being buried alive. This is not an uncommon fear. I promise. And indeed, he kept his promise. Martha's back in the room. Washington says, "'Tis well." Washington out.
And that's it.
I mean, what a way to go.
Well, I think what you've nicely pointed out is that most people in the 18th century dealt with these kind of maladies over and over and over and over again. Dysentery, the bloody flux, it was a recurrence. Smallpox reared its ugly head time and again. And, once you got it, you were immune. And then, as you said, during the war, he took the risky step of inoculating his troops. But, giving them some immunity. At the time, they don't understand germ theory. They're not quite sure what causes these things. But as you point out there at the end, he does confront his own mortality. He realizes what's happening, and even though he several times before thought that was the end, he kind of realizes that's the ball game, and he reveals himself to be a little bit of to be afraid there in the last final moments, even though he is in complete control of his own dying.
There are some really pivotal moments. It's dramatic for Washington. Washington, he lived through all these dramatic events, but I don't think of him as like a very dramatic person. I always say that he was a reluctant revolutionary. He wasn't like, he's not a Bernie Sanders. He's not out there saying like, tax the rich. He was the rich. But he, it took him a really long time to build up to things. And even during the war, like a part of it was he could be really calm. He did freak out quite often, but he didn't do it in front of other people. And this is so vulnerable. He's vulnerable. He also thanks the doctors, and he tells everyone they did as well as they could, which was, respect and a service he often gave to white men who were around him, who he did approve of. And then he shows his fear, which I think was sort of a Washington family fear of being buried alive, but not uncommon, because how they know so little, as you said, like they don't know anything about germs. It's unclear if we know much about germs, but they definitely didn't know a whole lot about, it was pretty scary. So I think he did. There's so much of Washington, the way that he, that is what's amazing about Washington's body is that sequence of events, not only the diseases he survived, but those final days. That is Washington, absolutely.
Well, and I think as you pointed out as we began the broadcast, even before we got dropped off, is that you were trying to understand Washington the human as opposed to sort of the marble edifice. And I think people do reveal themselves in those final moments, and you get a concrete sense of who Washington was, both his strengths and his weaknesses as he confronted his own end. Well, Alexis, the good people have been patient. Fortunately, through the interruption, and now we're back up. So why don't we take a few questions from the audience and see what we see?
Yes, please. You pick. I'll go blind.
Sure. So Zachary says, "Do you believe that George Washington would have lived beyond 1799 if Washington's doctors had left him alone?"
Well, what if Washington had left Washington alone? I mean, he made the first, who hit who first. He did. He went out and he lived his life. It's sort of, again, can't help but bring it back to the current moment. But it's like when you see all these kids on a beach in Florida and you're like, what are you doing? And then they get sick and you're like, that's sort of what happened. Washington was an old man by that point, certainly for his era and his family. He knew he was on borrowed time. He wrote this very dramatic, many dramatic letters in his final months. Some of them were like to get out of weddings. He's like, oh, we're not going to travel anymore. We're done. But, some of them were like, saying what we're saying, which is, I'm the only remaining child from both of my father's marriages. That's a lot of kids.
Yeah. And he's very aware of it. That's a great question. George wants to know, did Washington's near-death events add to his confidence and his bravery?
Yes, but he wasn't cocky, I would say. As a young man, again, we've discussed, like, he had some things to work out, as we all do. I think we can give him a pass on that one. But he when he was confident, he erred. He was not a perfect man.
Mhm.
Um, he was human, so he was, we can't talk about him in these ways, like the greatest man, all of these things. But um, he was confident, but he listened. Like, it was one of the most important things about him, both as a general and as a president. He surrounded himself with smart people. Sometimes people who disagreed with him, right?
Mhm.
They were perhaps he you know didn't they were monarchists, let's say, or they were accused of being monarchists,
Yeah.
and seemed to be very fond of it. Not naming names here, but I would say, so he was confident, but he listened. He sort of he to say he was confident, um, that's not what makes a great leader.
Mhm.
A great leader is made by not only confidence, but he was really intellectually curious.
Mhm.
It's often presented as a way to make up for what he called, his deficient education, that so many other founders had been educated at fancy schools.
Sure.
Adams at Harvard, Jefferson, College of William and Mary, and they wrote this way. And Madison, before he was, a bad James, like, he was a good James, and he was someone that, like, Washington, relied on. And so I think that it's just really important to remember that
Mhm.
like he read a ton because he wanted to understand things, and everyone at that at point was sort of like, of these sorts of men were like very into innovation, and women too, obviously, but the men of the founders.
Sure. Sure. At CY wants to know what were some of the more unusual cures that doctors tried on GW for his various illnesses like smallpox, ulcers, or dysentery. We've talked about bloodletting, which is the idea that you drained the malady from the body, you sort of purged yourself of the evil. But what were some of the other ways that doctors or physicians tried to treat these diseases?
So much vomiting, so much vomiting, so much vomiting. A lot of things coming out of everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of making that happen. I, I would just say watery gruel. That's not a thing I want to have
Hmm.
ever. So like the
Yeah,
cures, I think they were just sort of like sort of like FDR's 100 Days, right? They're just throwing things against the wall to see what sticks. So really anything is a cure.
yeah.
But those were really the unusual ones. I'm trying to think. There was, I mean, things we would no longer give people, like mercury or chlorine
Oh,
and things
sure.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those
Mercury is
are,
what killed.
yeah.
Yeah, mercury is what killed Patrick Henry in the end. He had an obstruction. They tried to give him
Yes.
mercury to move it because it's a heavy metal, and if it wasn't going to move, they knew it was going to kill him.
Yes. If you're ever in Fredericksburg, you should check out. I went there when I was researching, and Mary Washington's house is there, and it's like a very cute little
Uh-huh.
town. But don't they have an apothecary there? That's sort of a historic apothecary where the Washingtons did get some of their medicines, and they have these, like, they have a little note outside where they say, like, just in leeches and things like that. So it's really a fun place to go if you're ever in Fredericksburg. But those are the sorts of things
Yeah,
I would say he went through them all. I can't really
yeah,
think of, I mean, anything that was available, he took. And that's the thing, like Patrick Henry
sure.
died. Washington had taken some, he survived. It was a numbers game.
Yeah,
It was luck. It was also that he was, again, like an athlete. He would probably, like, of the ranks of like a professional athlete, it seems.
yeah. Well, when this is all over, let's go to Fredericksburg and check out that little place.
Oh, that sounds nice.
At, Adam would like to know, can you talk about the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793 when Washington was president?
Yes. Well, I feel like you know a lot about this too, but I'll start and say that I think one of the most important things that happened was he got out. And,
Mm-hmm.
he and different members of the government, moved out of Philadelphia. They did
Sure.
understand that, diseases in populated cities, the way we understand, and, where I am in Brooklyn, that this happens, that it spreads very quickly. And then, I mean, there were a lot of losses, though, particularly in
Yeah.
Philadelphia. It was a strange time to be there because, the president's house, which we sort of skipped over, is in Philadelphia, which you can, it's no longer standing, but a really moving public history site, the outlines of it. And then there are little feet in the ground where you can see Ona Judge and other Hercules. And Hercules escaped from Mount Vernon. He fled, but there are definitely, a lot of, there's movement. It's an incredible, I think for not having a structure, it's an incredibly moving site. It's right near the Liberty Bell. But Jim, I mean, you can speak also to the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Did we lose Jim?
Oh, sorry, I'm back.
There he is.
Sorry. You were saying about the incredibly moving structure in Philadelphia.
Oh, and I was saying that those to me are sort of like he made early smart decisions that were just like finite. But of course, add anything. You know this quite well too.
Yeah, of course.
Probably better.
Well, I perhaps not, but I'm not the Washington expert. My expertise actually is on Scotland and the American Revolution, but I'm learning quickly in my job here at Mount Vernon about all things Washington. All right, let's have another question here. Let's see who we got. Bonnie would like to know, was it Washington's idea to inoculate the newly enlisted, or was it on the advice of another? That's a great question.
It was certainly heated discussion, and inoculation had been illegal, and so it was contentious. You had people like Washington who understood the connection because he had experienced it again. Like, this is something he went through. He did learn from these things. But there were plenty of people who were, as we've discussed, rightfully afraid of medicine, modern medicine, and doctors, like his wife, like Martha. And so I think that if he wasn't the progenitor, he certainly pushed it. And he was right. He was absolutely right. And it was, I should say, not only was it a risk, he was fairly certain that people would survive. That wasn't the thing that worried him. It was that it took a lot, there was a quarantine. People got sick. And so it took soldiers out of action for a little while. And that was a huge deal, because you have to remember that we were not... this war was impossible. We were completely outnumbered. We have like a boat. We have like a rowboat, and they have like the greatest navy in the entire world. They've been around for a long time. We're like day one. So it wasn't, it wasn't foreseeable. So it seems risky, but it was actually, I think, just brilliant. And probably the most solid information he was going on, because it was intimate knowledge. So I would say that, it's always hard to say like this person thought of it at this moment, unless it's everyone agrees, and that is difficult in these time periods. But he pushed it hard, and he was right.
Sure. Well, and I forgot to note earlier when we were talking about the smallpox inoculation that to plug another book, the historian Elizabeth Fenn has written a terrific book called Pax Americana, which is about the smallpox epidemic that swept North America between 1775 and 1783. So if listeners out there, the viewers out there, want an interesting book on that 18th century pandemic, I encourage you to check that out. CD wants to know, what is the truth behind his teeth? How did it impact his health overall?
Interesting. Well, we don't really know those. The second part of the question, we don't really know how it impacted his health. We know how it impacted his portraits, because his jaw is sort of funny in them, and how his public presence. He was always reticent. He thought about what he said before he said it, and he had this charisma, right? So people just like waited for him to speak, whereas like John Adams just like and Hamilton just all over the place.
Just gonna say whatever they want.
Yeah, really, and just really fun to read that. Really fun letters to read. Exactly. But Washington was so controlled, but he was very self-conscious. And it seems like not just because he, was uncomfortable, like he wasn't quite sure what was going on, because these things were changing. It seems like fairly often. Not great news. At best, he was a poacher. He, ivory, walruses, elephants, they were sort of whittled down, and not whittled, that's what you do with wood, which is the craziest story about Washington. But so part of the dentures were made of that and wire, and part of them are human teeth. Enslaved people, and this was not uncommon for wealthy people at the time. Washington, however, he did buy some teeth from his dentist, and we know that his dentist put out ads, and it's instructive. We know from Washington's ledger, though, that it just made sense to him to source closer to home. He owned hundreds of people. He did pay them for it. He paid them slightly less than his dentist was offering, but he did pay them. Now, how he got those teeth, whether they had come out, whether they were pulled for that purpose, I don't know. He wasn't the tooth fairy, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I will say that's one of the big research questions we have in Mount Vernon is the relationship between his dentures and the possibility of enslaved human teeth in them. And so that's one of the active things that we're working on right now to establish those relationships. And we do have a set of dentures that do have probable human teeth in them. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out through a whole host of various techniques. All right. Kathy would like to know, what were hygiene practices in his house? This is a great question because we all practice modern hygiene, or at least we aspire to do so. What was hygiene like at Mount Vernon in the 18th century?
Well, let's just say my hands are like extremely dry from washing them so often. I don't think that was happening. They didn't know. There was a certain level of cleanliness. Washington certainly commented on people who were not clean in their appearance. I think that there was, what you would sort of see in period movies. They get up, they splash their face, they do a little sort of like light freshening up, and then they go about their business. But it wasn't, bathing was not very frequent, and when it happened, it was great news, but didn't happen all the time. He did buy toothbrushes, and we see that early. We see that in his 20s. He's buying different things, so he's like aware this is happening. And Martha is, as a result, constantly telling all her relations to brush their teeth and to take care of their teeth. Teeth are a bit of an enigma. I think let's give him a break here and say that some of it was hereditary. Some people are just born with weak teeth. His dentist gave him a talking to in several of the letters and would say things like, I think these are so brown because you've been drinking a ton of port. And because Washington would keep them, and he kept, when they would fall out, and he kept them in a desk drawer, and sometimes he'd write home and be like, hey, can you get those teeth? They're in the locked drawer. And sort of, FDR had the stick, and Washington had the box of teeth. He didn't walk around like that. He didn't need to. But he had them, and the dentist was always like, they're not going to work out this time the same way they didn't work out the last time because you're not taking care of yourself. But his drink was not port; it was Madeira. So clearly, they weren't that close.
Yes. Exactly.
That's the takeaway. Well, that is the takeaway.
We've got time for a few more questions. Let's see what else comes down the pike. History and Aviation wants to know, was the disease that killed him common during that time?
I mean, if they knew what it was, there were some, I think one of the younger doctors wanted to do a tracheotomy, which they would just cut. And so I think it was somewhat common. And I think there were inklings about what it was. I don't know if that would have saved him or what they would have done after they cut him open, because you risk infection. I mean, you don't risk it. You're inviting infection in that case. We would risk infection. And so I think it was fairly common as far as anything was, any of the diseases that he experienced were common.
Sure.
I do feel like it was his time, though. He was kind of on the way. If it wasn't this, someone else might have gotten him.
Well, I mean,
not a person, a thing.
Right. Well, the 18th century threw everything they had at him. And finally, it got him right at the very end of the century.
Seriously.
Yeah. Let's see. What else do we have? Allison would like to know, do you think that bloodletting contributed greatly to his death? That's a great question.
If it did, it's his own fault, because it sounds like everyone was telling him to stop and he wouldn't. So, yes, certainly, but this might have just been it. This might have just been the thing that he unfortunately was felled by.
Yeah.
Um, but it does seem like the description, that I referenced earlier, where Leo says it's just sort of like coming out really slowly and thick. You don't see blood that looks like that often. It usually, gushes out. So that
Sure.
suggests that he didn't have much left. So I do think, telling different people to bleed him more, bigger cuts over and over again. Martha was nervous around these things, but I think she was also really nervous at the recklessness of Washington during that time.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's see. Nolan would like to know, following the death of the general, did the medical practices at Mount Vernon change?
There's this funny, the doctors exchanged letters in which they're kind of like, we did everything we could. No one can sue us for malpractice. Not that was happening, but like the letters are really interesting. And I think a part of it is imagine, and I think every physician who has attended to a president or a person in the government of great import feels this way, that
Mhm.
it's a terrible amount of pressure. And of course had no longer, he had been out of the presidency, but I mean, can you imagine a bigger legend than the
Sure.
general turned
Sure. Yeah.
president? I mean, he's the most famous man in the world. So very stressful. So I don't I do think that tracheotomies became more common after this, and they were still fairly new. But medical practices, it's sort of like fits and starts
Mhm.
for a really long time.
Oh, sure. And we didn't really understand germ theory until about the 1890s. I mean, that late. That's when we sort of made the connections between, microscopic viruses and things that made us sick. So it took a
Yeah.
while. All right, we've
Okay.
got time for one more question, and let's see what we've got. Chelsea would like to know, can you speak about your experience writing this biography as a female historian?
Well, I certainly knew what I wanted to do. And I think that was lovely. Again, just because it was so male dominated. And, I think that they had taken a gendered approach.
Hmm.
And so I knew that I wanted to look at things that they had sort of ignored. And that had to do with his mother and slavery and other things. Not ignored, but maybe misunderstood, or just sort of repeated each other, or felt like defensive around him. And something, that's important to remember is like, George Washington is historically significant. If he's your role model, that is great, but that is a
Yeah.
personal choice. And um, I think that he will always be central to our country and always be incredibly important to us as a nation and our founding ideals, which makes it even more important to look at him very clearly and to be able to hold, and Jim, we've talked about this before, be able to
Hmm.
hold several things at once, which is that he was incredible and we owe him our country. If he had not been him, I don't know if many things would have happened. But he also, did terrible things and was greatly disappointing in a lot of other ways. And that is
Sure.
okay for us to hold these things. And we need to look at him no matter what. He is, again, so important to us and our country. We'll never understand it if we don't understand him. Um, and I think that's something that I really went forth with, that I didn't see in other biographers. And I
Hmm.
don't know if that had anything to do with being a woman. Certainly the fixation on his masculinity seemed odd to me. Treating women like fully fledged people, reading literature about family in early America, which I don't think they did very much. Giving his mother a fair shake, which is becoming more and more common.
Hmm.
And then, there were certain things like when I would go to Mount Vernon, there were a lot of men at the symposiums. But I sort of just took that in. It didn't bother me. And
Sure.
it didn't make me feel like I didn't belong. And I think a lot of that has to do with the wonderful support that I got from Mount Vernon, and the fact that Mary V. Thompson's the person who we all, notorious MV, we all go to her. So it's like, while it is male dominated, there is this woman
Mhm.
who is sort of at the top of it.
Yeah.
And I think that, and gets everyone's respect very clearly.
Mhm.
And I think, I had Martha Saxton on the phone on occasion. I had a male fact checker at the George Washington papers who also
Mhm.
worked on the TV series with me. And I don't know. So I did. It obviously was really central. There was something that was recently written that said something like that writing about being one of the only women, like dominates, that I wrote about that, and dominates the whole, I guess, preface or introduction to the book. And it's really just a paragraph about me, and the rest is about all these women. Like I talk about Erica Dunbar and Annette Gordon Reed, and sort of, no one exists in a vacuum.
Right.
We all have to sort of like build on each other. But these, I could name all the women. So I think that is significant. But that doesn't really speak, like the experience was fine. And maybe it's because I don't know, no one was mean, no one was too sexist, and I wouldn't have cared. This was my deal. I was going to do it, and I was going to do it to the best of my abilities, and surround myself with the best people to help me. Because everyone needs second readers and help. And, it's a tremendous amount of material.
Sure.
I would say the reception has obviously been, there's been a lot of focus on it. And I think that's great, because it brings attention to women who are writing about Washington. And Karen Wolf has done a wonderful and responsible job of talking about that, and also of really talking about responsibly leveraging on my success, which I want people to do. And
Sure.
And I think that is really important too. I would say the wonderful part about, I would say most women historians in this era is we are very, I say most, very supportive of each other. And there's a current Washington fellow who I talk to fairly often by email, and I'm working with her on her book, her next one, Cassandra Good, who wrote a great book called Founding Friendships.
Sure.
Sarah Giorgini at the Massachusetts Historical Society, who wrote a great book about religion and the Addams family. And she can't get rid of me. I've been bothering her for years, way before this book, and will forever. She's still my favorite person to see when I go to Boston. And so, yeah, I think that the experience, while, I'm in a minority, has mostly been wonderful. The collective feels really strong. And Mount Vernon, men and women there have been really, really supportive and wonderfully welcoming. And I had a great time. I spent the night there, and it was fun to see everyone in a different capacity. And, I hadn't seen some of them in a couple of years. We've just been emailing. So I would say that it's been great. I feel really well supported. And I don't, again, like, come up right behind me, like, do it, like, it's yours for the taking. That's the thing. It's a wonderful thing to be a woman historian, because for so long we were sort of excluded, or women were the men, and now it's sort of like, yes, we have a lot of work to do, but that means there's so much for you to do. Like, Jim, you've been to graduate school. When you enter, you're like, oh my God, what do I do? Like, how do I find something that's different and unique? And, how do I find the thing that nobody knows about, or that people haven't done, or like the one thing they've missed? There's so much.
There's so
much as a woman to do, and as a person to do. And so it's just, I would say it's a very exciting time.
Well, and I think that's a perfect way to end it. That's our charge. Alexis, we did it.
We did it. Thank you all for your patience.
Yeah, despite the hiccups, we got through it. And, I just want to thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank
you. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in this evening. As a reminder, you can buy your own copy of Alexis's book through the Mount Vernon gift shop, and also Mary Thompson's as well, and a host of other books by a number of excellent historians that we have mentioned this evening. A reminder that we will be doing live streams every weekday at noon through our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. And be sure to tune in next week on April 7th at 7 p.m. for a conversation with the historian Edward J. Larson about his new book, Franklin and Washington, The Founding Partnership. Alexis, thank you very much again. It was great to see you. I hope to see you in person soon.
Me too.
Stay safe, everyone out there. I'm Jim Ambuske, and good night and good luck.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.